it's important to recognize, and this is also very essential for me to do, is that this is a Western European idea that humans are separate from nature and are superior to nature. It is not a universal outlook. And I really want to avoid what Dr. Juanita Sundberg calls, quote, colonial ways of knowing. Many cultures, including indigenous cultures here where I live, and people in other parts of the world, have long believed that humans are one of many actors on planet Earth. So this is not a discovery of a new outlook, but rather I like to think of posthumanism as an engagement with long-held ideas. So I conducted a multi-species ethnography, and this is an emerging area in ethnographic work where the researcher considers humans and non-humans in relation to each other. Or as Kirksey and Helmreich write, and I read off the slide, multi-species ethnographers are studying the hosts of organisms whose lives and deaths are linked to the human social worlds. So I chose to consider people and plants because, as Besky and Padway write, plant entanglements are never free from the weight of history. So plants might be quiet, they're sessile, they can't move, well, they don't walk, but they do a lot of moving. But they have long participated in political acts, even violent ones, as Padway and Besky really illustrate well in their work, such as colonizing territory. A powerful example of partnerships between people and plants is settler agriculture here in Canada. The farmer and the wheat plants working together to mark territory, to stake claim to land that does not belong to them. So these partnerships between humans and plants are called vegetal politics, a term invented for the page, not for the mouth. This is a concept first articulated by Head et al. Vegetal politics are defined and quote as the collaborative and conflictual relations between humans, plants, and others. So it's a concept of what is being called the plant turn, and this is a growing interest in understanding how plants, often invisible plants to many humans, how plants exert influence on human social worlds, interest growing by qualitative researchers in the social sciences and the humanities as well. So this is the theory, the ontology, and the methodological approach that I brought with me to the field. So I started my field work of human-plant relations in Toronto, and the dissertation was a mixed method study of human-plant relations in the city generally. I conducted key informant interviews with gardeners, as well as garden visits with these gardeners and various gardens around the city. These gardeners were selected for a diversity of backgrounds, different relationships to land in terms of ownership, different socioeconomic statuses, different countries of birth. I conducted a survey online and also in person with people who grow food in Toronto. I conducted also this multi-species ethnography that I'm focusing on today. And the site of the ethnographic work was the Regent Park neighborhood in downtown Toronto. This is an area that has been undergoing massive transformation from a social housing community built after the Second World War to a dense mixed income area. And it's also an area where community gardening has been long recognized in people's lives. So what I'm gonna do now is play a video and that we're gonna go for a 1 minute and several seconds drive around Regent's Park as a tour. And I will tell you about as we go on our tour. So this is Regent Park. When it's still not finished, the redevelopment, you can see the older buildings in the front and the newer buildings in the south end that was redeveloped first. This is, in the newer area, now you have a swimming pool and a beautiful big park and a cricket field and all sorts of even private amenities that weren't there before, like a bank, a supermarket, there are cafes. And the neighborhood has changed a lot, but you still have the separation between the old and the new. In the old, you can still see signs of where gardening has been so important. So as the car pulls away, you'll be able to see that tucked behind these buildings, you won't be able to see them, are the community gardens that remain. So in the newer area, of course, these spaces tucked behind these buildings, but they have the same footprint around the back, are where people grow food now. These were mostly eliminated in the newer part that you can see those high rises in the background. Those are a mix, of course, of condos and public housing, more condos than public housing. The ratio is tilted heavily towards condominiums. But so you can see that the different landscape, how different the landscape is. You look down the street right now, the difference in landscape between the old and the new. I'm just going to come out of, so it's not being very nice right now. Okay, there we are. And so these pictures are these are pictures of what's in the back that you can't see from the road, a community garden. And then that summer that I started working around the perimeter of some of the old buildings, people started to plant food where previously there'd been that scraggly lawn or dusty earth. So the photograph on the left of the squash vines climbing the building, that is one of these new gardens. The gardeners did not have permission from the Toronto Community Housing Corporation to grow there. People told me conflicting stories about who the gardeners were even. They're kind of mysterious. So people in the neighborhood, everybody started to call them the guerrilla gardens. And all this provided a rich scenario where people and plants intermingled in a changing neighborhood. And this provided me with the empirical setting to develop my fieldwork method to identify vegetal politics and to account for food producing plants as political actors. So because I was conducting a multi-species ethnography, I had to decenter the human. The participants in my study were both the gardeners and their plants. So this meant I had to figure out how to account for plants and their agency. And I thank my doctoral committee for allowing me to do this, for not only allowing me, for supporting me and cheering me along. Because I was so interested in vegetal politics, I wanted to consider the political agency of the plants. And this led me to questions like, what of all the things around me in this garden is data? It's kind of overwhelming. If plants are participants too, and what counts of evidence of their political agency? And really, my supervisor, Dr. Blake Poland, asked me very pertinently, this was a really important moment for me, what is done beyond what is undone ontologically? So that's something I still think about often. To try to answer these questions, I developed a methodology that is grounded in the work of other scholars who do human plant qualitative research. For my own purposes, I created a 3-step method to account for the agency of plants and to explore these politics in the urban vegetable gardens. Before I go on to describe what I did, I want to recognize that the idea that plants that can be social actors, I know, is a challenge for some people to accept. These ideas may even require a suspension of disbelief. The idea that plants can be participants in critical qualitative health research fundamentally challenges a Euro-Western worldview, and it troubles ideas about nature that have been produced since the Enlightenment. So it's beyond the scope of this talk for me to delve deeper into this, but I did want to mention that scholars like Sylvia Winter and Val Plumwood have argued about how the production of race and gender is tied to an idea of man, man with a capital M, and that there are parallels between the domination of nature and the oppression of women and of racialized and colonized people, as well as indigenous peoples. And so all these groups that have been defined as other, they've been defined as other to man and to nature and as nature. And this argument that Euro-Western ideas about nature are a social construction and are informed by colonialism and racism and gender, this is also central to my work. My 3-step method was recognize plant time, participate with plants, and scale up. Now, I'm only going to talk about the methodology itself in broad strokes today because I thought the story of how the method came about might be of more interest to the CQ audience. And I'm going to focus more on the process as opposed to the outcome. But in broad strokes, just so you understand where I was going, recognizing plant time as opposed to, say, Greenwich Mean Time allowed me to understand the relational nature of time and to understand how perceptions of time in the garden shape the research. By participating with plants on their time, I better understood the relational agency of plants, and that helped me to see plant agency as an effect rather than the manifestation of, quote, unitary intent. That's Sarah Watmore's words I'm using here. And then by step 3 was scaling up. And by scaling up, I mean that I wasn't seeing plants as individual actors, like what is the agency of that zucchini plant, like that particular plant vis-a-vis that zucchini plant, but rather I looked at the agency of all the plants working together, and this allowed me to identify the collective agency of the plants. Oh, I think I advanced that too soon. Multispecies ethnography asks the researcher to decenter the human authority and bring to the fore the beings that have typically been considered merely background to the human plotline in ethnographic research. So plants are participants in my study, and that I consider them, full stop. They are promoted in my study to actor as opposed to just being the foliage. And again, this raised some questions for me. I'm going to repeat the questions. If the foliage is a participant, then what in this garden is data, and what counts as evidence of vegetal politics, and what is being undone beyond what is undone ontologically? Those were big things to wrestle with. But data analysis turned out to be my friend. It was integral to my methodology. I coded the data in vivo, and I also turned to a kind of data analysis sometimes called post-coding. And I looked to Jackson and Mazet's data analysis technique that they call thinking with theory. And they say that, and I quote, data is partial, incomplete, and always in a process of retelling and remembering. And their technique involves what they call a diffractive reading. This is a process of encountering data while holding on to theoretical concepts. Anyone who knows the work of Karen Broad is going to be thinking diffraction and Broad. Yes, that there is a connection there. And they also do this by plugging data into theory and theory into data. It's a methodological process basically that means involves holding on to the theoretical concepts while looking at the data. And I envisioned it a little bit like looking through a pair of theoretical lenses. It raised for me connections with the sociological imagination. Lisa Mazet, however, described this technique very nicely in a podcast. And I thought it would be nice to hear from her directly, since I relied so heavily on her technique in my work. So I'm going to play about 1 minute and 30 seconds of Lisa Mazet talking. She's a professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Oregon. And I'm going to warn you, the sound in this podcast is not super, but you can hear it. It's a little bit tinny, and that's how it started. It's not just the speakers here. And the interviewer in this podcast asks her to explain their analysis method. And I did really want you to hear from her, so I'm going to play it now. And Mazet starts by saying, we wanted to show
how you could take a concept and use it to open up a different set of questions or a different way of looking at data. And we wanted to also demonstrate that there was not just one way of looking at data. And part of this from our own work, because you mentioned my work on silence earlier, and I had started starting with my dissertation, but did a lot of work using the concept of deconstruction to theorize silence and to think about silence as data. But then I got stuck because I was trying to think about, in this research with white teachers, why did these silences persist? And then I started, through kind of circumstances, I started reading and thinking with Deleuze and Deleuze's idea of desire and production. And so it gave me a different way to think about why the silences persisted. And so this idea of, in the book Thinking with Theory, is we wanted to take the same data set and show how there were different, not that there were different definitive answers, but there were different questions and different ways we could look at what was going on. And so that was that was sort of what led to the project and how we envisioned it. And
so how did I implement Lisa Mazet's technique and think with posthumanist theory? So I tried a number of different concepts from posthumanist theory. If one didn't yield a result that I found to be interesting or insightful, I just moved on to the next concept. To give you an idea of how it went, I tried Donna Haraway's companion species. This is a very popular, often used concept in posthumanist explorations of health and non-human nature, or not just non-human nature, health and non-humans. And then I also tried cyborg, which has been used in the city to understand, Donna Haraway's cyborg, to understand the city and nature. And then I also looked to other writers' concepts like Tim Ingold, anthropologist Rosa Braidotti, a little bit of Bruno Latour. But the concept that worked best for me in the end was non-human agency. And I plugged the concept of non-human agency and plant agency into my data, and I found that this led me to questions that were really relevant to my topic area. It enabled me to attend to questions of power and politics. It turned out that non-human agency was what Jackson and Mazet would call a threshold. Thresholds, they write, contain both entries and exits. They are both / and. So non-human agency with a threshold in that it pushed me to ask questions like, what role does plant agency play in a city through the production of health? What is plant agency? Can plants participate in politics? And what are plant politics? And I believe the concept of non-human agency led me to what I found to be an intriguing path through this post-coding exercise, because it fundamentally allowed me to decenter the human. It helped me to see plants and their relationships with humans, and it allowed me to see the relational nature of time when working with plants. It allowed me to see plants as actors working together in a collective. It allowed me to scale up and see this collective agency of all the plants, as opposed to just looking at one individual plant. And that's because early in the research project, I really was struggling with this idea of agency, because I struggled to find meaning in the pea plant that curled its tendril towards a tomato stalk, for example, rather than the bamboo pole that a gardener had put there for it. So what was the meaning of that agency? Was driving me to distraction. But this diffractive reading of the data shook up my interpretation of what I was seeing, and it helped me work better in this posthumanist ontology and allowed me to ask this new set of questions, just like Mazet said happens when you work with theory in this way. All this led me to make the arguments that plants in Regent Park have been actors of significance in the redevelopment of the area and health supporting actors. So I found that the plants and the gardeners of the study exist in a mutualistic relationship. They exist in a state of multi-species entanglement that supports their health, both their health. Humans provide, plants provide food for the humans, healthy food, culturally meaningful food in many cases, and they offer people mental health benefits that the gardeners told me about, such as one of the participants, Raji, she said to me, and I quote, "The plants are my friends too." On the other side of the relationship, the humans have responsibilities to the plants. They take care of the plants and they provide the conditions for them to thrive. So in this way, there were what Alex Nading calls leaky boundaries, or fluid, his expression, fluid interactions between people and plants. The fluid interactions that produce this health supporting entanglement. The political agency of the plants was the product of their interconnections with humans and the health supporting role they played in the gardeners' lives. So in this way, I found that plants quietly supported the work of humans to advocate for space in the redesign through these relationships, and also through their physical presence in the neighborhood. It really is an area where, if you're attuned to it, you'll see food growing everywhere. Just from a position of a passerby, you can see the plants taking a stand on how space gets used. As Besky and Padway would say, they're marking territory. I'm going to end with a short summary of what happened in Regent Park to illustrate why I came to this conclusion, just the narrative, the story itself. in what ways the plants shape the new area. So you have to go back in time to the start of the redevelopment, when the importance of the relationship between people and plants in Regent Park was recognized by this big report produced by the Toronto Community Housing Corporation. This report recommended that the city's Parks Department consider how to include gardening in the parks that they were going to be creating. They created this large park, and it also offered a second recommendation to continue to find space for food production in Regent Park, because there was intensification and a lot of space that had been growing space was now condo space or supermarket space. Interestingly, these recommendations were listed in the report above other important recommendations like community and economic development. So gardening did end up being incorporated in this overall design of the neighborhood. There is in the big park in the center of the neighborhood, there's this large community garden, very centrally placed. I haven't seen anything like it in another park. And along with a greenhouse and a bake oven, there's a community center, community food center, also with a large street-facing garden. That the community food center plays an important role in the community. There are fruit trees in the park, a demonstration garden in a little square in front of the medical building. Also, the building design responded to the need for growing space in the community. Rooftop gardens were incorporated into social housing. So people who live in the social housing can grow food on the roof. Also, the condos, there are also rooftop gardens where people are growing food on the roofs. So both privately and publicly owned buildings have these vegetable gardening plots on top. I do note, and I address this more in my written work, that the guerrilla gardens are testimony to the fact that there is not enough growing space in the new neighborhood, but nevertheless, growing space has been included in that neighborhood. And I love these pictures. I don't, to me, it just says with the plants in the guerrilla gardens, these are two guerrilla gardens with the plants growing up the buildings, the bricks of the buildings. So this talk is based on a journal article also that came out of my PhD thesis. The article has been accepted for publication next year in the Journal of Environmental Humanities. And I'd like to thank very much my PhD committee, Blake Poland, Kate Mulligan, and Dr. Cole, Donald Cole, and who allowed me to do this in the first place and enabled me to do this fun work. We had a good time together, I think. I'd like to thank Shirk for my doctoral award and the Regent Park Community Food Center that allowed me to volunteer in their gardens for that summer. And thank you very much for having me here today. So these were my questions. I didn't know if I should, I see Paula is back, but I'm left with questions myself, that I'm always questions, right? And I'd like to continue to do posthumanist health research. And so I'm now in the work that I'm embarking on now, looking for how to think about posthumanism in the context of other projects. And I'd really be interested in hearing from others where they think this might happen, as the questions on the screen suggest. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Sarah. If you would just, I think you could put those questions away for now so we can open up the floor. And those questions will be in the chat afterwards. So when we open that up shortly. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much. It's been great sort of working with you as you've been developing this talk. You know, I know there's going to be some really great questions, you know, if I get a chance. You know, I'm imagining, or I'm wondering how you get consent from plant. I see their little leaves going up, like I give consent. I don't know how that works, but I'm sure we'll have questions about that. But it's my great pleasure to start off the questions and also maybe some comments from Joan Eakin herself, who is here with us today and who this award is based on, and who is the founder of CQ and past director, and has said that she would start things off. So to you, Joan.
Can you hear me, first of all?
Yeah. Okay,
and can you see me? I'm not too
Yep.
clever. Okay, all right. I can't see myself, but anyway, Sarah, this award was named in my honor, but I must say it's a huge honor to have you as the awardee. Bravo for the award. Bravo for your stellar doctoral work. And bravo for a super stimulating presentation today. So thank you. I don't know where to begin because it's kind of ignited so many things in my head. First of all, as one of my little logos has always been everything is data. So this is, I mean, totally up my line of inquiry. So I love that part. But the other thing that it's making me reflect on is that you probably don't know, but some of my closer friends online here know that I'm a tree freak. I'm passionate about woods and trees. And of course, not too long ago, I read this book, The Secret Lives of Trees, which I don't know if you've come across by, I think it's Peter Labenvol or whatever. Anyway, I loved it because of course, it's the sociology of the woods. And I'm a sociologist and I just went in there and it just spoke to me. But then I discovered when I began to talk about it with a botanist friend and other friends, they thought it was just such a pile of hokum. You know, imagine thinking of kind of maternal relations and trees talking to each other and defending each other against chemical and insect invasions and so on. And so, I mean, I realized, ooh, now what is going on here? I mean, I just loved it. So the kind of things that you're talking about are just speak to the struggle I had with that non-acceptance of something that I thought was terrific. But when I hear you talk, and I kind of get posthumanism, and I kind of get some of the stuff you're talking about, but being a retiree, I'm not totally up to snuff on all these new things. But I love the idea, I've always loved the idea, and that's the essence of kind of the critical perspective of kind of working with concepts and looking at concepts as being something that obviously comes from someplace, but they have an effect because they create what you're talking about. And of course, we all know that it's not possible. We can never escape our own the limitations and the nature of our own conceptual apparatus. So even if it's posthumanism, everything we're seeing is through human eyes and human concepts. And so I was thinking about some of the concepts that you were working with, even though you've distanced yourself from the classical definition of the term. For example, agency. I mean, agency, I know it's obviously been used in a way that isn't, you know, strictly kind of human, but it does embody an idea of doing and being in a certain kind of way. And so we're saying, okay, how do plants have agency? And I was thinking, maybe it's limiting to take, well, of course it's limiting to take a word like agency and then try to think about it differently for plants. But maybe what's needed is a totally other way. Like when I'm in the woods and the woods speak to me, I don't actually feel it as agency. Yes, they have an effect. Plants have an effect. Plants have consequences. Plants have functions, to use an old-fashioned sociological term. But the notion of trying to figure out what is the relationship between plants and people in a new kind of frame of reference, I think we're hobbled by words like agency. I wish you could be inventing a new concept rather than adapting an old one. So I thought maybe you could maybe say a word if you've ever had any other conceptualization or some other word that could capture the different meaning that it's being used at in relation to plants.
Oh gosh, I should have reviewed my my defense notes that I was for I didn't.
That's not intended.
I'm joking. I also have an excellent book to recommend called Tree Culture by Jones and Cloak, and it's deals in a lot with tree agency. And they, in fact, argue that there's much more in common between human agency and tree agency, and actually argue that there is intent. So that book might be extraordinarily intriguing. It was enjoyable. But so I do, yes, I obviously, as you can probably see as I talk, like agency is something that I'm constantly struggling with because of the ontology I was raised in versus the posthumanist ontology, and so that I have adopted. And so the agency, I'm okay with that term because I read so much posthumanist theory, but it's really a relational agency. So it's not like it's completely separated, aside from Jones and Cloak, and everything I've read, from intent and the effects that take place because of a relationship. I don't know if I'm answering your question clearly, but so the agency of the plants in Regent Park is manifested through the role that they play in people's lives. So it's much more subtle than the agency that I've, and I cannot remember the name of the theorist that I would have cited had I studied. It's a different kind of agency.
Okay, I mean, I hear you and I know what you're talking about. I just wish you could invent, you'd be the perfect person to come up with another concept for that, so it isn't associated with old notions of agency.
Yeah, no, you make an excellent point also in that the language is so important, because it doesn't matter if posthumanists in the small club have worked out what agency means and how relational agency takes place in the relationship between non-humans and humans, and that effects are caused because of this relationship. That doesn't matter if a certain group understands that. It's like, how do you, I'm someone who, I situate my work in terms of thinking about climate change and food systems, and I consider myself to be a critical food system scholar. So how can our food system be one where that is not harming to the world? So yes, the language is important, and perhaps that could be a route to, like, what other word to describe that?
Thank you, Joan, and thanks, Sarah. I'm sure that this we're going to open up the discussion a little bit more. So there's a hand raise tool. I see Barb's got her hand up, so she already knows how to play in the sandbox. So putting your hand up. You can also, the chat is now open, and so feel free to contribute that way. And if you feel comfortable putting your camera on, especially when you're asking questions, it would be great to see you. So Barb, please.
Thanks so much, Sarah. That was amazing presentation. My first comment is those are really difficult concepts to present to an audience where some people are familiar with them and some people aren't. And I think you did a stellar job. It was a masterclass in how to present post-human theory to a diverse audience, something that I struggle with all the time in my work, and I know other people on the call do as well. So I really appreciate it, and congratulations on that. I want to help out with the discussion about agency, because it's something that I've been grappling with for a long time as well, and I think it's such a great question. And I'm with you, Joan. I know that you get it, that it's something different, and that the old terms actually keep us stuck in the old ways of thinking, and that so we probably need new concepts and new terms to be able to grapple with what the new thing is we're talking about. I always feel like agency is still used because it's very provocative. It's very provocative saying plants have agencies. It gets people to sit up and listen, right? What do you mean? But I wonder, and Sarah, I'm really interested in your comments on this, because I know it's not exactly the same thing, but I wonder, you mentioned the concept of desire early on in your talk. And I wonder if desire or affect might be alternate concepts that are talked about quite a lot within post-human theory that help us to understand that relational version of agency, in that we think of desire and affect as powers that move actors to act, but that they're not based in intention. So desires are produced and are also productive. And again, we have to get away from thinking of desire as a want or a lack, but as a positive productive force. So I'm interested in if you think that helps with answering that query. Thanks.
Thank you for your comments and your kind words and your question too. I strayed away from that language because of my obsession with politics. And so that's why I kept on coming back to that question: what is done besides being undone? Pushing me towards like what does this tell us about power and politics in the city? And so that's why I went with agency, and see the power of that term, in that they are like, they actually, I really believe it fundamentally. And so and as a scholar, I have to check myself, because just because you believe, I can't have faith in just my deep belief in this. But yeah, they as political actors, they act upon the process, the political process, and so therefore they did have there is agency. They are transforming Regent Park. They and I won't go over what they did, but they actually shaped the buildings are different. The park looks different, and so that is why, as though agency is such a powerful word, it worked for me in this project.
Thank you. There's a question in the chat, which I'll just read, if that's okay, Sarah. And again, you please feel free to type or to, put your hand up. I'm sure your head, like mine and Joan's, it sounds like, is just firing. So this is a question. Thank you so much for the presentation. Somebody did a MRP in early childhood studies and used post-human theory to explore relations and power dynamics between young children and plants when they share an indoor play area. So one thing that I think it's Lee grappled with as a settler researching within the colonial system of academia was a concern that in using post-human theory, I was participating in the extraction of indigenous knowledge. So could you speak to your ethics around citational practices and how or if a relationship with indigenous knowledge of this land came through your work in Regent Park?
Thank you for that important question. So that is something, how to make posthumanism not a colonial act is something that I'm committed to. And Zoe Todd argues for what she calls a citational rebellion. So every article I write, I have a little endnote in there saying I'm participating in a citational rebellion, and I am engaging posthumanism, which is different from indigenous knowledge. It isn't the same. It isn't the same thing. Posthumanism really is a product of Euro-Western thought, and some would argue, some have argued very eloquently, way behind indigenous philosophies. Well, we're really stuck on agency. That's old news. And so what I try to do is put, and there are indigenous scholars who are doing this, and other scholars as well, put posthumanism in conversation with indigenous philosophy. So, when exploring agency, for example, I'm citing other people's work, indigenous scholars' work, and I'm using specifically the work, off the top of my head, what's excellent, and if anyone is interested in reading the work of Bawaka et al., is a group, coalition of scholars in Australia, and they are indigenous, and I don't know if they call themselves settlers in Australia, or like we do here, but they write together, and they recognize the agency of the land in their research to the point that they give first author to the territory Bawaka where they are writing. So and so they have a lot to say about non-human agency. And so when I'm struggling through a concept, I'm citing, I'm engaging, and I'm looking to these knowledge systems. And I hope that other posthumanist scholars will also continue, as I'm by far not alone doing this, to do this as well.
Thank you, Sarah. I think that this is a question from Will Valley. Are you on the call? Do you have a question? It's actually a clapping, not a hands up. So I don't know if it's a clapping question or.
It was a clapping, but and so thanks so much, Sarah, for this. And thanks for, I guess, yeah, I should be more careful with my icons. But I do have a question, and it's maybe about your teaching and how you bring this into your teaching when you teach about food systems. I teach also about food systems at University of British Columbia, and sometimes when we talk about plants, we respect the natural science, like the botany perspective, because we're in a faculty of natural sciences, but a big part of me is trying to bring in and expand what's possible through the types of ways you're speaking about plants as well. And sometimes sometimes it works well, and sometimes I feel like I'm harming that perspective by making it, giving people more fodder for thinking that I'm speaking beyond what a scientist should speak about. But I think there's something really interesting about the intersection of these two, the botany perspective, but also what you're representing. And then how do you bring that into your undergraduate or graduate teaching? And thank you.
Thank you for your question. You know what, that in fact, an answer to this takes me, I will answer your question, to my question to the audience, which is generally how can posthumanism work outside of a posthumanist world with a niche, small little group? So how can I continue to do posthumanist work and do critical food systems work? How is there an opportunity for these two worlds to come together? So I don't have an answer to you about food systems yet, and because I'm seeking. However, I do teach research methods. And in my research methods class, I use this. I do talk about posthumanism, and it's like the best way to teach undergrads about ontology, because I find it really they get it. And I wasn't going to, but one of my senior colleagues said, "Oh, come on, why are you holding back on the hard stuff? Like, give it to them." And it goes over so smoothly. I absolutely adore teaching research methods. It's actually my favorite course to teach, because we get to talk about ontology and methodology, and they're so keen to learn. So it's very positive. So I didn't really answer your question because I don't know the answer to that. It's hard. Like, how can I be not a food scholar and a posthumanist scholar? How can I deal with the materiality of the world and the philosophy? But there are many senior scholars here who I'm sure are dealing with these kinds of questions, who might be able to help those of us looking for a way.
I'm just, in light of the time, thank you so much for the question and your response, Sarah. I know that we said it's now on the hour. I say that because we're in different time zones. So I just want to formally end the official part of this talk, because I know an hour is what a lot of people sort of set aside. And just to say, please stay on the line. We're going to continue the conversation with whoever would like to. Sarah's going to stay on the line, and I think Jen Poole has a question, a follow-up question that I think might get us started on a conversation. But thank you again, Sarah. I didn't acknowledge Tenzin, who's working in the background. She's the admin person for CQ, who's been really helping with the technology. Thanks to the awards committee. To Joan for being here, and for Brenda. And please stay tuned to CQ's site, stay on our newsletter. We're going to continue to do seminars in the near future anyways, online. And it was lovely to have all of you from all over the place. So thank you again. please stay on and put on your cameras if you would like, and we'll stick around for, can't offer you pizza, but we'll stick around. So thank you. And let's start the questioning. Jen, if you're on the line, if you had a question, that would be great.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for that. I have covered an entire page in notes and exclamation marks and stars. So thank you for all that you have gifted us today. I want to go back to something that you said when you were responding to Joan about the effects that take place because of the plant and human relationships, right? And it sounds to me that there were very meaningful moments and relationships for you in the process of doing this work. So my first question is, how are you in relation to the plants and the gardens and the gardeners that you visited and worked with? How are you in relation to them now?
Ooh, that's a very interesting question. So how am I in relation to them now? So it has fundamentally, doing this work has fundamentally changed my perception of my multi-species relationships. So I am lucky, and I wrote at length about this, probably the only place where I could write at length about this in my thesis growing up. And I was lucky to grow up in a household where I was attended, nature, as my father called it, was always around us and something that was really important. And so I'm lucky to have this awareness that was taught to me by my dad. But this work has changed me fundamentally because in fact, it's made this to be more of a burden, frankly, because I see the responsibilities I have with my plants, and I see it. I really see them as relationships. The multi-species relationships I have, that I have to care for them, and the compost in the backyard, what relationships I have with the plants that I live amongst. In terms of the gardeners from the study, I don't live very far from Regent Park, so I'm very lucky to be able to go back there quite regularly. Not obviously in the pandemic, though I have been able to go back and manage to keep a connection to the neighborhood. And when I go to work, I pass through the neighborhood as well. So there's a way that I feel connected to that community, even though the actual ethnographic work is officially in the past tense. But it certainly has shaped the way I grew up in Toronto. It certainly shaped the way I see the city, but also how I understand humans and plants and see my relationship to my garden.
Thank you.
I think Brian Dale. Brian, are you still there? I think there's a question that you had your hand up earlier.
I did, thanks. Thank you very much, Sarah, for the great presentation. It was really interesting to hear more about your work and your dissertation work. People on the call won't know that necessarily that you and I are doing some work collaboratively on a new project, and so I was just wondering if you've thought about the agency of plants at all in terms of your current research and thinking about supply chains and global agriculture and food systems and the potential for disruption and the limits and possibilities for plants in terms of feeding a city like Toronto.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, you know what? I'm glad to know that we can have a conversation now that continues from here, because Brian and I are collaborators. It is something I'm thinking about. I'm doing a really like a study basically about how has COVID-19 had an impact on the fruits and vegetables that are imported into the Ontario food terminal that feeds Toronto, Ontario, and beyond. And so this is there's a reason I posed those questions to this audience, is because here's my new research question is way less theoretical, and it's about supply chains, but yet plants are, like, I'm constantly reminded in the interviews with participants of the agency of plants, even though they will not say the agency of plants, but they talk about Mother Nature, the trees, the corn. There's all this, like, I haven't started data analysis at all. Well, I shouldn't say that because I'm speaking to the CQ audience. I can admit that I'm constantly in dialogue with my data and analyzing. But if I were in a different audience, I'd say I have not started to code this work yet. But no, but I'm really, yes, in the ongoing process of interrogation of my data and plugging theory into data, I'm stuck at the agency of plants. Yes, I can see they have agency in the pandemic, in that, like, the season keeps going. They are completely oblivious to all the other issues like missing labor. I have a fly flying in my face speaking about multi-species relationships. They're oblivious to all these other structural, socio-political, economic powers that are constraining, enabling, et cetera, and they keep going. But that's where I'm at. And I want to go deeper. That's not satisfactory feeling right now. Like, so what? They have agency in this food system, but what does that mean? I look forward to conversations in the future and unpacking that.
Thank you, Sarah. So, we'll open this up. We want to continue the conversation, the methodological and theoretical conversation that CQ thrives on. So are there any more questions or comments for either Sarah or anyone else? Denise, awesome.
Sorry, I think before me is the colleague in my screen behind, underneath, Synergy.
Sorry, I don't know if you're referring to me here. I had a question. I couldn't figure out the button for the raising hand, so I put the hand clapping. But I don't know if I was before. This works. I'll just go ahead and ask it anyways. Yeah, I really appreciate this presentation. It's really thought-provoking. I was just wanting I'm kind of circling back to the discussion earlier about the use of the word agency, and I really do think it's an intervention. Yeah, as was mentioned, like, we recognize that term, and it's to make the point of really thinking about what we mean when we say agency in the context of humans, and what is so different about that of non-humans. And I think so. I really appreciate that use, because it makes you think, and it's highlighting that this word that we've used is maybe not so exclusive. But I'm also wanting to think back to the discussion on intention, because you mentioned that Tree Culture book combines intention and agency with respect to trees, whereas other post-humanist scholars don't so much. They separate them, and it's just about agency. But I was reading Vanessa Watts. She's got an article, 2013. She talking about indigenous ontologies, and how for indigenous ontologies, for many of them at least, the intention is absolutely part of non-human agency. Non-humans have intention as well. And she was pretty provocative in this article, talking about how the post-humanist desire to de-essentialize in terms of thinking of things as relational outcomes rather than essential plants or animals or anything like that is colonial, because it's undermining the sort of the stories of or the histories from her perspective of these plants and animals in their culture as beings with intention and stuff like that. And I'm excited about posthumanism as well, and so this has really made me grapple a lot with these questions, and I don't have any good answers, but I'm just wondering if you're familiar with that and if you've sort of thought about that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, so Vanessa, that is an excellent article by Vanessa Watt. I think I know which one you mean. The title is escaping me, but actually I can look it up on Zotero as I speak and say that that is an example of indigenous philosophy. And so that is one way that, like, that's an excellent critique. It's called Indigenous Place Thought and Agency Amongst Humans and Non-Humans. First Woman and Sky Woman go on a European world tour. Decolonization, Indigeneity, Education, and Society is a publisher. Anyway, it's excellent. And it really shows the difference between, back to the other question that we had earlier about indigenous theories. Dr. Watt really demonstrates the differences between the two, and is very asks many questions of posthumanists, and yeah, it's an excellent article.
Okay.
Sorry, we've got Denise, and then there's something in the chat, and then I think Clara's got her hand up. So now we're cooking.
So thank you, Sarah. Very stimulating presentation, and congratulations on the award. My question refers to methodology more specifically. How important it is to engage with visual methods in order to study these other forms of agency? And can you give examples of what you have done in your work, given that I haven't read your thesis yet? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So that's really pertinent to plants, because other qualitative plant researchers really write a lot about visual methods of observation, photographing plants to see how they've changed over time because you can't see them. And for some reason, it was just a personal wish. I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to take photographs. But I did use visual methods in observation from a different scale. So I was flummoxed when I was in the garden and observing. Like I would write field notes, and then so I could tell from my field notes that even though I hadn't taken a photo, the zucchini had grown from Monday till 2 weeks later. Suddenly I had to. Or the tomatoes, I was always being asked to trim tomatoes. I had to trim the tomatoes again. So I knew they'd grown, and I was wrestling with that. But the way that visually it helped, in fact, was combined with motion. And so I would use my bike to travel through Regent Park and do mapping and observation of space. And so in that way, I don't know if that, as I'm talking it out loud, I don't know if it's the same thing as the visual methods that the other qualitative plant researchers use. It is different. It's more, it has like I'm not a geographer, so geographers might be cringing, but it has that a little sprinkling of geography in it, in that the observing and of the space allowed me to scale up in my analysis. So that was really integral. It was step number 3, and that was because of the bicycle and my eyes looking. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you. Here's a question from the chat is, did you ask the gardeners what they thought about plant agency? As a gardener myself, I would say that gardeners and others who work intimately with plants are very acutely aware of the multiplicity of plant agencies, and also that not all plant agencies are the same.
Yes. Are you reading the question from Kate Sandyland? So I'm familiar with their work, and yes, I would say that, yeah, gardeners did speak to me about plant agency, but not about political agency of plants. But they would say, yes, that plant doesn't want to grow there; it wants to grow here. Or like they were the plants in the gardeners' words did reflect a notion. Not everybody, but for some people did. I could see how they saw them as beings with whom they had a relationship, and these beings had agency and even intent. Like they would go further. Some people, other people saw them as neutral things, but some people definitely would go further and say, no, they have wants and desires, than I would, for sure.
Thank you. Clara, you had your hand up.
I had my hand up. Thank you, Sarah. That was fantastic. I really love your presentation, and there are so many things that resonated with my thinking and my work. So congratulations, it was amazing. I don't have a question, but I do have a comment that I really want to share, and if I don't share it, it's gonna get stuck. And I wanted to share it with you, and maybe we can continue the conversation another time if you're interested. As part of my work, I'm studying also the agency of artwork. That might seem strange because say how, I mean, plants still are life beings, but artwork is not alive. So how can you study the agency of artwork and the role of creativity in modifying that agency? So that's one of my line of work that clearly resonates with a lot of the things that you said. And I had one comment to what you just mentioned. You talk about how that you're thinking about how plants might seem oblivious to our political issues and how plants relate to the political agency. And I've been thinking about that quite a lot, also related to my work. And I thought that plants are oblivious to our political issues as much as we are oblivious of their political issues. And we don't even know their political issues because our ontological views sometimes kind of ignore, or we don't even consider their political issues in the way that we study them. So sometimes I'm trying to push forward my thinking for the past months. And I think that for understanding plants, trees, animals, artwork agency, we might need to change the whole system of how we look at them. So again, I mean, they are as oblivious to our stuff as we are oblivious to their stuff. And to understanding their stuff, it's complicated for us. First of all, we are ingrained in this, in our, as you said, we can call it, I don't know, we can call it many names, but our traditions or epistemological, ontological views. I mean, it doesn't matter the name that you give it, but we are really stuck into that. So changing the way that we understand the whole structure so we can understand the agency of non-human beings and things, I think that requires something new. And you kind of mentioned that, and Denise, you did that too. And I would like also to comment on that. I think that that's related to other sensorial types of data. So you can call it visuals, you can call it, I don't know, smelling, like smells, flavors, even feelings, I don't know. I mean, there are other types of data, because all of data is data, John, but there are other types of data that I think that if we reflect and try to understand why types of data and what types of data, that can help us go deeper and have a shift in our conceptualization, so we get a deeper understanding of what we call agency of non-human beings. I don't know, it might, sometimes I don't verbalize that very well, but I'm happy to continue the conversation in a written mode that sometimes is easier.
I would love to speak with you because it's not often I get to talk with other people who consider the agency of non-human things.
No, we don't.
Yeah, so yes, let us connect. Just what you made me remember for the health people in the room still, there's a social science and medicine article from last year that describes the work about non-humans and their impact on health, and it's not about non-human nature. It's about all sorts of other non-humans. So I think that your work with artwork is not I don't know how to say that. It has lots of good company.
I appreciate that.
Thank you, Sarah. Maybe we can share, you could share that article afterwards and we can put that. So I had a hand up, Summer.
Yeah, Jennifer Sumner.
Hi, Jennifer. Sorry.
Hello, hi Sarah. Wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. Just a quick comment on what Brian said to you. I did research on in that area of sort of, you know, food chains and thinking about it was very important. The relationships were very much part of that and the relationality. However, nobody in any of the research talked about the plant-human relationship. It was always among humans. So I think that might be one way of looking at that. But my main question was about, from a political economy perspective, political economists are interested in power and stuff and the tension between structure and agency and how structure can enable or disable agency and vice versa, of course. And that tension between structure and agency, what kind of enabling structures can you think of that would enable plant agency, especially in terms of thinking about what can be done and not undone?
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm scribbling down madly here. That's really, really interesting. That's a very good point. I'm not going to answer your question because I think I have to sit with it. What kind of enabling structures enable plant agency? Because that takes it beyond the human-plant relationship, and it really situates the human-plant relationship in the society and the social structures. And that might actually get even deeper into vegetal politics.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you.
We'll continue this.
We'll talk, yeah.
Later. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anybody who's on who would like, there's a couple more questions in the chat, but I just want to give people who are still here a chance to engage. L. Burberry, you had a question. Do you want to read, you want to say it out loud, or would you is that okay? Uh-oh. Maybe.
Hi, sorry, I'm in the middle of 10 different things. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries. It's Lizbeth Burberry. I was just wondering, I was thinking about Joan's questions, and I'm wondering if agency ever was just not more than human from the start. So in other words, perhaps we don't need a new word for agency, but rather need to open up the word to always recognize that it's always already been entangled with more than human matter and matterings. So I was just wondering if maybe there was something there to think through. And then I just wanted to ask the presenter, Sarah, if you have read Robin Kimmerer's work. Her work, especially Braiding Sweetgrass. I know that you're making a distinction between indigenous thinking and indigenous traditional knowledges and posthumanism. In my work, what I'm actually trying to do is to rethink my posthumanist work through indigenous traditional knowledges in a way that highlights the borrowing that has, or the stealing that has been done by a lot of settler scholars using posthumanism without that recognition. And so even as you make that, that idea of staying within posthumanism, I don't like these distinctions. I think they're silos. Some of you know I talk about anti-disciplinary work. So I'm wondering if you could even pull in some of this work from Robin Kimmerer. She's a botanist. And her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, is magnificent. It's just one of the most beautiful things. If any of you haven't read it, please pick it up. And she talks about energetic reciprocity and architectures of relationships and the ways that we can bring science, art, matter, and spirit, indigenous knowledges, and colonialist science into a new species of knowledge. And I just think that is so sexy and just where we should all really be considering going as we engage with some of this posthumanist work. So more of a comment than any type of question, and just thank you for your presentation.
Thank you. Is there, before you leave, I would really love to read what your work, when you're thinking through and talking about the indigenous traditional knowledge relationship to posthumanism and Where would I find that? And I do know Robin Kimmerer. Yes, and I agree. Amazing, amazing.
Oh, she's amazing. Why don't, maybe I'll just give you my email and we can chat.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat. I'm at University of Waterloo.
Okay.
Yeah, because I'd love to get a lot of your references. I tried taking pictures of all of them so I could look them up.
Okay.
So thank you so much.
I'll email you. There's many connections being made here. Thank you.
Yes, take care.
Amazing. I'm just in light of the time, we've got just a couple more minutes. Andrea, did you have your hand up? We've got a couple more minutes.
And I posted on the chat as well, so ignore my question on the chat. So my question to Sarah. Hello, Sarah. Wonderful to hear about your work. How did you include or exclude animals in your research? I was just curious because battling with a garden and animals the whole time, how to see the plants by itself without the animals seems to, or the soil seems to be missing something. So how do you include that?
Yeah, that's an excellent limitation of my work. You're right. How do you separate the plants from the biota of the soil and the nematodes and the rabbits? So I also did work in a lot of work in another garden outside of Regent Park. So where the rabbits come in, people kill the rabbits because they don't want them to eat their plants. And in Regent Park itself, there were, because it's so urban, the animals weren't such an issue. They didn't come up in the garden at all. It's something I actually haven't thought about. It's interesting that you should ask that. But I'm flipping through my brain right now, and in Regent Park, there are bees, insects, people remarking on that other life, but not actual mammals or animals or creatures. Worms, they did vermicomposting. So yes, that's a limitation I had, that I cut off the other beings.
Yeah, that reveals for me the importance of positionality. Because from my perspective, like I have the raccoons, I have the birds, I have the squirrels, everything, all the plants I had were interacting with them the whole time. So I'm in a region with a lot of, we call it the highway of wildlife, because there's so much stuff, and it's not far away. It's in the West End, but in Toronto as well, which leads me to another, just a comment about the last one. Positionality, right? Because for me, from a South American perspective, I'm Brazilian living in Canada, and this struggle to marry, to accommodate the indigenous philosophy with this posthumanist philosophy, because we have a different reading from it, right? I mean, that everything is together, the colonialism, the patriarchalism, the capitalism as well. Then it's hard to just choose like one path, you know. So I'm here, I'm just saying that I defend whatever path you are in. You don't have to feel guilty of not following this or that path, because we need a diversity of paths or explanations. We won't find the final one that explains and responds to everything, right? I mean, so on this perspective, I just want to contribute to that, and thank you again for.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And I love this. You know, this is a good CQ talk because we're left with so many more questions and dilemmas and challenges and issues to work through than we started with. I'm just cognizant of the time. I just want to say thank you again, Sarah, and to everybody who participated today. Great questions, really stimulating conversation. And we look forward to seeing you all at the next one. So thank you.